consciousness is the starting point of reality.
Completely antithetical to that attitude in science.
What is reality?
We're now at this great inflection.
Video games and all of that is actually the most important spiritual tools we've got today.
The whole point of a virtual reality is to have useful fiction of causality.
The individual never gets enlightened. It's the enlightenment that becomes the individual.
Space-time is doomed.
Consciousness is fundamental.
Einstein's theory actually predicts its own demise.
Balance is not the ability to stand up, it's the ability to rise up.
Please like, comment, and subscribe.
The notion of resistance is interesting to me because it's part of everyday experience, right? We all have the experience of once you've learned something, you're glad you know it. But going from not knowing to knowing is usually problematic. Kids they would rather do anything else but learn to write, learn to do mathematics. But after you've done it, then you open up a whole new world of pleasure and exploration that you would never trade. And you look back on the resistance that you had as a child as silly. It was a strong resistance, but it's always silly. And so there's always this going from what I know, the comfort of what I know, into the unknown. There seems to be a bit of a terror, because you're literally going into the unknown. You don't have the safety blanket
Right.
of the ideas and concepts that you already know. And so that again, from the point of view that you and I are both talking about from different directions, it seems like that would be an essential aspect of this dynamics of ever evolving self-knowledge, that it's inevitable that there is the letting go of the known, which is partly terrifying, partly exhilarating, coming into a new kind of understanding, which then you have to sort of settle into it and understand it. I still remember as a kid when I first learned how to read, like first and second grade, and we were reading about Tom, Dick, and Jane and their dogs, right? And I talked to some fourth grade kid and I said, "So are you still reading about Tom, Dick, and Jane and their dogs?" And they said, "Oh no, we're reading about other stuff." And it was a new concept to me that reading could be about anything but Tom, Dick, and Jane and their dogs,
Yeah,
right? It was
right.
you sort of settle in and see what the new technology, the new realm of understanding all of its potential. So in some sense, that's not going into the unknown. That's exploring the known more fully.
But that's
and
part
seeing
of it. Again, we have to look at the horizontal versus the vertical consciousness, because the vertical
Exactly.
consciousness is what expands, and the horizontal consciousness is linear. So basically, how things work in the low level of consciousness, which is most life forms, it means that survival and is connected to the expansion of awareness, because one has no sense of what one is actually doing and why. So survival and procreation is everything. So it's all based on survival, and basically what you have to do to survive leads to evolution. And so you have to learn, you have to improve, you have to change in order to survive and survive better and to rise in the hierarchy and all of that. But that also means that you will have to confront your own fears, your own limitations, your own karma, different forms of resistance, and you grow kind of horizontally. But the essence of that change then triggers the expansion of the vertical awareness, which is the real one, until a certain point. Because when you go deep into spiritual studies, at some point, instead of having identity with yourself as a person and the horizontal reality, the vertical takes over. And from that point on, you're able to expand your awareness directly. You don't have to go through interacting with the world. Because basically, what I can say is this is a virtual reality where you will act based on your assumptions and your resistance. You think this is how things are, this is what it's supposed to do. And then life shows you, nah, you're wrong. This is how it works. And evolution is then, okay, I will adapt to that or I will die. But that change will in itself represent expansion of awareness. In a more mature spiritual awareness, you don't have to go through that because you're able to exchange directly with consciousness and the kind of network of consciousness that you're a part of. So you don't have to go through experience. You will be able to recognize, oh, I'm out of tune there. Life is vibrating this. I'm like here. I need to tune myself. And you can do that directly instead of going through actions and experiences that also serve the purpose of tuning you closer to the mathematics of life.
Well, yeah, that makes sense. There's going to be then some relationship between a dynamics of consciousness beyond any space-time limitation and the appearance of that dynamics of consciousness within a particular space-time VR
Yes.
set. And as a scientist, then what I want is a mathematically precise description of what the dynamics of conscious agents on their own terms, what you call the vertical part. I want a dynamics of that that's mathematically precise. And then what I want is to have a precise mapping of that dynamics, a projection, perhaps. So it's an information losing map from the dynamics of consciousness on its own terms into a particular space-time VR headset. And under that projection, then I should see that deep dynamics of consciousness looking like what we call evolution by natural selection, with fitness and survival of the fittest and right. Things like that. And so that means that the ideas that we're talking about at a very high level, in principle, we want to cash them out with absolute mathematical precision. What exactly is the dynamics of consciousness and what we call the vertical part, right? Consciousness on its own terms, not limited to space and time. And what is the exact projection into, first, what is space-time? So we have to have a mathematical model of space-time, where the physicists now have given us quite a bit of work on that, which is quite interesting. Space-time itself it turns out to be an incredibly beautiful structure. It's a data structure that's really beautiful. We can talk about it if you want. But then the projection, we would have to show not only that dynamics of consciousness looks like evolution by natural selection, but also that in some sense, other ways of looking at that dynamics, other projections of it into space-time look like Einstein's theory of gravity, look like quantum field theory, and so forth, so that we see the theories that science has given us as headset projection versions of this deeper dynamics of consciousness. So in other words, the goal would be the ideas that we're talking about here at a very, very high level. Ultimately, the way we can test those ideas, right? We have some, maybe they're good, maybe we're on the right track, but we have some bad ideas here and there that would take us down the wrong track. How are we going to figure out and refine our ideas here? Well, we make the mathematical model of consciousness dynamics precise, make the mapping into space-time precise. Again, not that we're right, but that we're trying to be precise so we can figure out quickly where we're wrong.
But I've talked with other scientists about this, and the way I see it is that since space-time is part of the projection, it means that it changes when your consciousness changes. Laws of nature changes. They're not constant because you are in fact your own dimension. You are a walking dimension. It happens just that when you have parts of what you vibrate that is exactly the same as someone else, then you will appear to be in the same reality. While in fact, the laws of nature belongs to you.
Right.
There are slight changes, but they are there. And it's interesting when people go through like deep spiritual work for a long time, they do experience that the laws of nature changes. And people have experiences, oh, they can actually, suspend laws of nature. No, they're not doing that. It's just different laws of nature. They expand, they appear differently because it's part of the projection. When they're then projecting from a different level of consciousness, different rules apply. And it's for science over time to be able to identify that kind of spectrum, what changes when someone is in expanded awareness, and then trace how laws of nature changes, because space-time in itself changes. It's not constant, it's part of the projection, and one has to understand this first and then try to explore that, because this is mathematical. So one will be able to figure this out at some point and then be able to measure the active level of expansion and understand what that is, and then trace that to how laws of nature actually works. But it's common in all spiritual traditions when it comes to deep work that one is able to go beyond the kind of collective kind of default setting of natural laws.
Yes. Now, on the science side of this, there is some interesting work being done on how interactions between entities, people, for example, can lead to a shared consensus reality. Some of the simplest models are called signaling games. There's a whole mathematics of signaling games. And then there's work, actually a colleague of mine and friend, Louis Narens, and a couple of his collaborators, Kimberly Jameson and Natalia Komarova. They've been looking also at how agents, and you could think of them as conscious agents, can start off with separate definitions of, say, color words, and how they can just start interacting and eventually converge on a shared consensus reality of what red means, what green means, what blue means, and so forth. And so there's a lot more work to be done, but you're right that there is mathematics here. Yeah, it's absolutely non-trivial mathematics, and I also agree with the intuition that somehow this kind of dynamical systems approach, where we have interacting conscious agents, where they're talking back and forth and converging together on some shared meanings, is in some sense going to be a mathematically precise way of getting the genesis of things like space-time. And that you're right that there are multiple solutions to this kind of convergence. And by the way, convergence in this scientific sense, it could be on the same meaning track as when you talk about vibrations, right? Because what we find when we look at the long-term behavior of dynamical systems, for example, what I'm looking at right now are discrete Markov chain models of conscious agents interact. And the long-term behavior of that, asymptotically, we get this periodic, what we would call periodic behavior, but it has a period. It's like a vibration. And we can actually, it's these stable periodic behaviors, the asymptotic behaviors, that sort of correspond to various kinds of solutions of this cooperation problem. And so I think that the language you're using seems to dovetail with the kind of scientific approaches that I'm taking, that they seem to be on the same track here, that we could give absolute precise meaning to vibrations, for example, as the strongly periodic behavior of the asymptotics of Markov chains. That are and those Markov chains could be instantiating these the rules that are involved by agents trying to communicate back and forth and come to a shared consensus of reality. And so it seems like we're broadly in agreement, and I agree with what I understand of what you're saying, that there's not just one kind of space-time, there could be many different kinds of shared consensuses that come up, and that's part of the whole exploration that the C, as you say, is doing here, is that there's not just one kind of consensus, there's unbounded kinds of consensus, and in some sense it's the joy of exploration of the various kinds of consensuses, and therefore the various kinds of asymptotic behaviors or the vibrations that correspond to those that is being explored here. Does that seem
Yes,
on the right track?
absolutely. And to me, mathematics is absolutely fundamental also in spiritual work, because, that is what kind of penetrates everything. No matter what type of reality we're talking about or level of consciousness, math is math, and I think that is wonderful. And to me, reality, we are able to figure it out. We can explore it. We just need the right tools, and we need to go beyond our own mind and our own definitions, because, the challenge with humans is often that once we have found, a definition, we will hold on to it and we'll just like build on that. And I think it's so important, both in spirituality and science, that one, is aiming for finding what changes everything. And I think scientists are actually better at that than people in spirituality. It is changing, but belief systems, no matter how they appear, is a big blockage. We need to look for the next thing. And to me, mathematics is the kind of language that kind of combines everything and makes it possible to kind of cut through all the manifestations that are the result of mathematics. But one will often say that mathematics is part of the vertical because it's the absolute source code of existence. So it is traceable, but one has to kind of explore reality in a different way with a different premise. Like one thing that I find really interesting, and I've also discussed this with a lot of scientists over the years, is that when I observe consciousness, it is mathematical structure. And I do refer to that as strings, because if we think of like a soul, which is also like an agent of consciousness, as I said, like somewhat of a source code, but a potential that is not truly available to the ocean because it has not been unfolded yet. So it's still just a potential. Once it becomes enlightened, it kind of permeates through all existence. So when you go back to the strings, the string activation will show you how much of what you are as source code has been activated. And this is basically how one can see expansion of awareness, because when one is able to observe the strings, one can observe if they have been activated or not. Because if you think of like each an individual, like each agent of consciousness has its own uniqueness, its own combination. And therefore the journey is unique, and the mathematics of that unit is unique. And the whole journey is about awakening and the kind of realization of the potential in those strings, and they're being kind of activated as vibration. So when we talk about dimension, it's also, one can see that, for instance, like in this type of dimensionality, it means that you and I and everything here will have some of the same strings activated. And then we can also have other strings activated that are not part of this, which means that you and I exist in two different dimensions. But we have enough strings activated to create the illusion that we are in the same space. But in reality, it's all unique. And that is kind of the mathematics that you can see go through everything. And the expansion is how much of that kind of string potential has been activated. One can also observe, for instance, in one string, one can learn how to observe like how much of that string has been activated. So it's like seeing expansion of awareness also as this kind of evolution and activation of the full spiritual potential, but it can actually be observed, and it can be observed as mathematical structure.
Again, I think we're largely on the same page. I think one thing I would say is that a lot of people listening to us talk and both of us praising mathematics might harken back to sad days in geometry class, or
Exactly.
fighting with their checkbooks to try to get things to balance and so forth. And mathematics seems like the enemy, sort of a dry, desiccated, barren enemy. And how in the world could it be what we're talking about as deeply important to spirituality? And the there is the sort of the precision that mathematics requires that many of us found really tough, because you're sitting there in fourth grade, you're trying to do some mathematics problem, and if you don't get it exactly right, you're wrong, and then it's a horrifying experience. But there's a lot more to mathematics. Mathematics is, once you get into it, for example, mathematics is a way to describe symmetry. Symmetries in nature. It's a way to describe structure. It becomes, once you get into it, beyond trying to fight with your checkbook and pass your geometry class and get through trigonometry and so forth, it's a way of starting to talk about the structures that you're seeing around you in a beautiful way. In particular, for example, symmetry. There's something called group theory, mathematics of group theory, which gives us a language to talk about symmetry, and it itself is a very beautiful language. And so it's like coffee. It's an acquired taste, right? The first time you taste coffee, it probably just tastes like this bitter drink. But after a few tastes, once you get past balancing your checkbook and passing geometry and so forth and getting through your trig class, you get to a point where all of a sudden you begin to realize that mathematics isn't just this nemesis that you have to get through to get to pass your classes and so forth. It's actually this wonderful. It's almost like a way of seeing that you get, and it's an endless new set of structures to see with, and so it's in that sense that we're using mathematics, and that's a sense that maybe because of our education system, at least the education that I got, public school in Southern California, I never really got the view of mathematics as beauty. I got it as this sort of barrier that you have to jump over just to get to the next grade. And I was never challenged by my teachers to see mathematics in a different way, as a beautiful thing.
I totally agree. And I think it's because people don't, teachers don't understand what math is truly about. Because to me, it is that the whole kind of structure behind everything. And it's so beautiful. And to me, math is just like art, because you can see the art in everything, but it's precise. And that to me is, the most beautiful thing about math is that you can test it and retest it. Like, it's precise, and it's true. It's, verifiable. And I think it's a shame that kids are not brought into the essence of mathematics and what it's like, what a wonderful tool it truly is. Because I think if kids connected with that, they would see it as the premise of every expression. And it would be so much more fun. And I think in this day and age, where facts and science are under pressure, I think, teaching kids about the beauty of science is really important.
Yeah, yes. I absolutely agree. To give this different perspective, I think it would unlock the beauty of mathematics and science more generally to students, and open them up to something very, very beautiful in life that they might otherwise miss. In mathematics itself, I agree with you about the precision. There is debate about the truth aspect of it, which is interesting. There are, for example, even within the philosophy of mathematics, there are deep discussions about whether mathematics is discovered or invented. And there are also very, very deep discussions about, for example, intuitionist models of mathematics in which there is no infinity, effectively. There's only arbitrarily large but finite things that you deal with, versus mathematics in which we talk about infinities. And so there are deep, and as far as I can tell right now, unresolved questions about the very foundations of mathematics. But again, I don't think that contradicts what we're saying deeply.
No, because
It
again,
means that
understand that mathematics in the horizontal works differently than in the vertical. The horizontal realities will always be limited because they are basically spaces defined by the collective consciousness and expression. There are always limits to that, and there will be, laws of nature, limits everything. It's supposed to be a kind of limited space for certain types of experiences. The vertical is different. So in the horizontal, it's not infinite. It's defined. So I think this is why it's important to understand kind of the two different platforms of reality we're talking about.
Well, that's an interesting proposal that the debate between intuitionists and those who think that infinities exist in mathematics could be related to these two
Right.
different kinds of consciousness. I mean that's a very, very deep issue. I think. I mean, that's such a technical issue. I'd have to really think quite a bit about that. I don't have a clean intuition right up front. And that's part of what happens in mathematics. I mean, it goes very, very deep. I mean, there are certain theorems that you want to understand this theorem. Well, it will take you 5 years of full-time study just to understand the statement of the theorem. And it's pretty intense. But I agree with you when you say that it's that precision that is going to be part of the engine of the evolution of spirituality and of our understanding of spirituality. Because as we talked about early on, spiritual traditions have had a lot of really good ideas, but not the precision to cast them out in a formalism where we can actually now say what our ideas entail. And do I agree with this entailment? So to be very concrete in terms of an example from science, Einstein in 1906, 1907, around there, had what he called the happiest idea of his life. It was like a deep insight for gravity. And his insight was that if he were in an elevator and the elevator were just dropped freely, so don't try this at home, but it was a thought experiment, he would suddenly become weightless in the elevator. So if he was standing on a scale, before the elevator dropped, he'd weigh whatever he weighed, 150 pounds. But as soon as you let the elevator go and free fall, all of a sudden he would weigh 0 on the scale. That was I called it his happiest thought. It took him 8 years to turn his happiest thought into what we call the general theory of relativity. The single equation, Einstein's field equations of gravity. It took him 8 years. And he was Einstein, right? I mean, it was not Hoffman. He's not stupid. He's Einstein. And so it took him 8 years to take his deep idea. His deep idea was right. And it took him 8 years to turn it into mathematics. And once he turned it into mathematics, a year later, someone looked at his mathematics, a guy named Schwarzschild, and wrote back to Einstein and said, you know what? And he told Einstein that his equation, predicted the possible existence of what we now call black holes. Einstein was horrified, absolutely horrified. That and again, he's Einstein, right? I mean, he's no slouch. He's brilliant. His own equations came back and slapped him, and woke him up to. Well, he didn't wake up. For decades, he disbelieved. He didn't like these black holes. We now have good evidence that they in fact exist, and so that's the point. Even if you're the spiritual equivalent of an Einstein, if we can take your ideas, which could be brilliant, Einstein's idea was brilliant. If we can turn it into mathematics, then the mathematics itself, which is embodying your idea, will come back and be your teacher, and will be the guide to the next step. And that's what we really want. By the way, it will also come back and teach you perhaps that your idea was flawed in certain ways, that there were these aspects of your idea that were great. Einstein's theory actually predicts its own demise. Right? This issue about black holes also is deeply connected with what physicists are now calling the catchphrase is space-time is doomed. Space-time itself is doomed. It cannot be a fundamental concept. And we get that from Einstein's field equations of general relativity together with quantum theory. Together, they actually tell us that space-time can't be fundamental. So that in some sense, the beauty of Einstein's mathematical theory of space-time is that it tells us that space-time itself is only an approximate concept. It's not, and it points us to something deeper. And that's going to be, I think, the attitude also that we want in spiritual traditions, that we've never arrived. We're always in progress of learning, and that we write down mathematics not to prove that we're true, that we're right, but to cash out our ideas as precisely as possible so we can become the students of our ideas and also learn the limits of our current ideas and get over our resistance to go to a deeper and more profound level of understanding, which seems to be what the whole dynamics of consciousness is about. It's in some sense an anti-dogmatic.
Yes.
It's precision in service of learning. Dogmatism and learning are antithetical.
Absolutely.
If you're dogmatic,
yeah.
you can't learn.
I think what you're touching on here, like, especially as I said, like, once you have the mathematical model, it will teach you, because this is such an important part of spiritual work. You will always have to start with your assumption, and you will have to test it out, and then life will show you that you're wrong. And because you don't understand everything, but math is precise. So to me, when you apply mathematics like to your spiritual work, this is exactly what's happening. Once you understand what we call spiritual principles, which is basically also math, you then can understand, oh, okay, the logic means that then it's like this and this and this and this. And then you can see that your understanding was flawed, and you will have to adapt, you will have to change it. So it's in spiritual work, it's always about getting to the spiritual principles, which is basically the same approach one has in science. It's kind of figuring things out, how things really work, and then what are the implications, and then go back and say, okay, I was wrong there, I was wrong there. And this is part of what I mean. Like, at some point in your spiritual awakening, you do not depend as much on physical experience. You're able to relate to spiritual principles, and you explore them, and you're able to see the math and understand, oh, I need to adjust that. Oh, that was wrong. And you're able to get a better and fuller understanding. And so it's that kind of dialogue between your current position and reality, and being in that dialogue. And I always say that you can never win an argument with reality. And humans spend all their time doing exactly that. Spiritual awakening is about figuring out how we are wrong, basically, and see that as the journey and have fun, testing out your assumptions, but knowing that the moment you do that, life will show you, life will teach you, and you will gradually go deeper into the spiritual principles, and it becomes more and more precise. And like one thing I often say is that it's interesting with precision, because in consciousness, as we often say, like the lower the consciousness, the more kind of widespread it is, because you're not centered, you're not precise, you're sloppy, and you have to test things out, and therefore you do a lot more. And the closer you get to the principle, the less you do, and the more you be, you become, because you're able to connect to the vertical. And if you think of the vertical as a principle, when you get into the precision of it, there's absolutely no movement. It's only the principle. So that's kind of also the spiritual movement. You start out by experiencing a lot and running around, not understanding anything, and gradually you understand a pattern. You gradually start to realize, different aspects, and you start like piecing it together, and you get closer and closer. And at some point, you in that process discover the vertical principle. And so you move into that until there's only the principle left and absolutely no movement. And this is also why in spiritual traditions, one tries to kind of nurture being instead of doing. The mistake is often that one hasn't done the doing first. So it's an ignorant being. You first have to do and exhaust that, and the being has to come as the result, the conclusion of the doing. And when you just go into that being and sit there, again, you're ignorant and you think you're enlightened, but it doesn't work in reality. So this is also part of what I think modern spirituality is discovering and changing, because, the assumption was wrong that you can just sit there in being and you will understand everything. You can only get to the vertical as the result of having exhausted the horizontal.